For the first American symphony that we're going to be playing for you tonight, it starts with a woman named Jeanette Thurber, who, like many of you, classical music lover, arts patient, who wanted to build a new American school of composition. And she looked overseas in the 1890s and propositioned the eminent Czech composer Antonin Dvorak to come to New York City. Dvorak said, "I would not dream of it. To cross the big water and risk my children to be drowned? Plus, America is full of Indians and wild animals." Eventually, Dvorak would relent. But when he got here, he was struck by the music, most notably the Native American and African American music that was already here. And he wanted to capture its essence by writing music in America. But the question we're going to ask tonight, is the New World Symphony a roundup of tunes made in the US of A, or is it a postcard home in the old world European style? Here is the opening in Dvorak's symphony, culminating in a titanic timpani outburst. Pretty radical, huh? But if we look at another piece by a very good friend, an ardent admirer and supporter of Dvorak, one Johannes Brahms. Brahms in the 1870s was the guy to know if you wanted to get your music heard and played. Listen to some of his first symphony. You hear that timpani outburst, big crescendo, diminished seventh chord, very, very similar. As we're approaching St. Patrick's Day, we have another element that a lot of people heard in Dvorak's music called the Scotch snap. It's a short note followed by a long note. Dun-da, dun-da, dun-da. And people say, oh, well, that's kind of jazzy, that's maybe American, but if you listen to a ton of other European music at the time, you hear it all over the place. Here is the Dvorak introduction. And here is another guy named Ludwig van Beethoven. Very similar, dun-da, dun-da, so there's jazz everywhere. The second theme of Dvorak sounds very, very folk-like, with the open fifths in the cello, and the octaves in the horn as well, which lends a very primitive sound to it, along with its modal nature as opposed to major, minor. So instead of a scale getting somewhere, you have a sort of mystical timelessness here. Some suggest that, well, that's Native American. It sounds folksy, it's very primitive, but when you put it all together like that, it could just as easily be Arabic, Hebrew, Irish, a medieval French dance, Gregorian church music, or Czech polka, which it most likely was. As we move to the second movement, Dvorak inscribed the beginning of a legend, and that legend was Hiawatha, from Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's Song of Hiawatha, which Dvorak actually had huge plans, if he would have stayed in America, to write it as an opera and or cantata. This Song of Hiawatha catalogs the legendary hero and founder of the Iroquois nation after many adventures, including the creation of everything, slaying vicious beasts that read very much like the tales of Wainamoinen from the Finnish Kalevala. Hiawatha returns home with his bride, Minnehaha, and they hear the bluebird and the robin, very similar to Beethoven's Pastoral Song. Dvorak loved America. However, he experienced a lot of nostalgia. The The Germans would say Heimweh, a lot of homesickness. And at this point, he's trying to tell his story, and he can barely continue, he can barely speak because of this deep sadness that he's experiencing from being away from his home. Third movement, we go to Hiawatha's Wedding. Even though Dvorak based his movement on a Native American wedding ceremony, European classical traits abound. In the first part of the third movement, you have the dancing of couples, which is very, very similar to something you might recognize from Beethoven's Last Symphony. Or maybe from Clockwork Orange, if that's not. Here is the Dvorak. Notice the dancing of the couples and the call and response nature, first between the woodwinds, then the violins and the timpani. Let's try that. So we have one da da dun dun, one da da dun 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 dun. So you guys be the da da dun 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 dun. Can you try it? And one. Yeah, try it. We'll rehearse a little bit. One da da dun 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 dun. We'll try it. And one. And that's great. Now you guys are gonna be the answer to it, right? You've always had call and response in ancient music, church music, and jazz, and of course it's going to pop up here. So it's going to be one da da dun dun da da dun 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 da. So you can, if you haven't played in an orchestra, just act like you have. And one. That's not bad. That's pretty good. The next part of the wedding are tender songs of love. And you have these carefree woodwind conversations that could very much as easily have come from a Schubert minuet. If you weren't apt to label this as purely Slavonic, you might wonder how Hiawatha and his bride, Minnehaha, ended up in a German beer hall. You might actually think you're the victim of a vicious shark attack, but indeed, this is Dvorak. And actually, Dvorak would have heard a great piece by Modest Mussorgsky called Pictures at an Exhibition. Moving to a man named Richard Wagner, who was another force to be reckoned with in the 1870s, which is actually the period that I kind of feel like I'm from sometimes. Dvorak said only 3 composers have truly revealed the innermost spirit of religious music: Palestrina, Bach, and Wagner. Here, see if you can listen to this section from Dvorak. It's almost a practical quote from Wagner's Tannhäuser. Seemingly get back to something that is American. See if you recognize this. I'll give you a hint. Mice Blind 3. But it's actually an English nursery rhyme, and Dvorak Czechifies it just a little bit later. Dvorak written the ending like this, we might assume that he was out on the streets of New York listening to too much boogie woogie when he should have been composing. But indeed, he wrote it like this, making it the exclamation point to one of the greatest Czechoslovakian symphonies ever composed. Although Dvorak brought many of the melodies over with him from Czechoslovakia, it's hard to ignore the global elements of the symphony from multiple cultures, especially the homegrown American ones. Nor should we ignore the words of the pioneering African-American singer and composer Harry Burleigh, who sang Antonin Dvorak African-American spirituals. Through all these songs, there breathes a hope that everyone will be free.
Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot.
Global works like this remind us how connected we are in the great tapestry of the human experience, and we are very honored and excited to share Dvorak's Ninth Symphony from the New World with all of you.